Thank you very much. We wanted this to be intimate, but there's a good number of people here, and for all sorts of reasons, we're not going to tour through the exhibition literally, although we may do something of that metaphorically. So we're going to stay here, so make yourselves comfortable, and if people want to come in the foreground, please do. Gilbert and George really don't need any introduction, but I'm going to give them a brief one anyway. Sometime around 1967, they met at an art school, an illustrious art school in London called St Martin's. Within 2 years, they had uniquely become one artist, two people. There are many examples of collaboration in the history of art, but nothing is quite of the same force, intimacy and mystery as Gilbert and George's, and I'll try and tease something of how that works or not out of them during the talk. They proclaimed themselves to be living sculptures, that they themselves became the artwork, and this took all sorts of forms, singing sculptures, drinking sculptures. But I think for the purposes of exhibition, and certainly for the purposes of the way that they carved a central role for themselves in the international art world over the next 3 decades, it was with their photographic-based work, which was black and white, then there was colour introduced, and then glorious Technicolor. The other notable formal addition to their work was the use of computer-generated imagery from 2003. They've exhibited and have working collections in almost every continent. I think Arctic and Antarctica are not yet permeated by Gilbert and George, but pretty well everything else. In 2005, they were the representatives for Britain in the Venice Biennale. In 2007, the Tate Modern gave them the largest show ever at Tate Modern, living or dead artists, but they were also the first British artists to have a major show at Tate Modern, quite right too. And that show then toured in different guises, first to Munich, then to Turin, then it came to America, to San Francisco, to Milwaukee, and now in its climactic finale, here it is at Brooklyn. Gilbert and George, the first thing I wanted to ask you is, I think the most consistent thing in your work that anyone walking through the exhibition will see is the fact that the two of you are pretty well omnipresent in the work. Do you see these in any way as self-portraits? Can people see them in those terms?
No, we see all of our pictures as letters, visual letters to the viewer. So like every letter that you write, you will sign. Every artist signs his painting. And we took it one stage further and put ourselves in the picture. So it's us speaking to the viewer. It's not just a composition.
In fact, it is, we are the subject of all our thoughts. And that's what we're trying to make. All what is inside our brain, we're trying to shoot on the walls. But it's all based on us, looking at the world, feeling the world, and being alive today.
And we believe that in that moment that it's us speaking to the viewer, then it's very much to do with the viewer. If you think of being in a museum with a friend, sometimes you hear somebody say, "Oh, come and look at this Van Gogh over here, it's fantastic." They would never say, "Come and look at this tree with a bit of grass," because you know it's Van Gogh speaking to you from the grave.
It is even like a novelist. Is that novelist what he was speaking through the book?
So when did you realize, and how did you formulate what is in effect a singular voice that two people have?
I think it was based on being alone and being leaving St Martin's School of Art and not being able to do anything except walking the street of London. We realized that's it. We have to become the living sculpture.
Out of all bad luck, always good luck comes, we believe. So that when we left college, most people would say that we were down on our luck because we hadn't been the goody-goody students who would get a part-time teaching job. We hadn't been the goody-goody students who would apply for a grant for a studio. And we had no money, we were very poor. We were living in the wrong part of London. But that, in a way, was the best thing that ever happened to us. In that moment, we became the art, the subject and the art and the sculpture, everything.
And not only that, we believed so much in ourselves that when we went around London to all the galleries to ask them if they would do a show of us, they all refused, and we thought, "Oh, how brilliant."
We thought we must be right. We even went to see the head of the sculpture department a year after we left, the famous sculptor Anthony Caro. And we had a beer in a pub near his studio, and we explained our new thoughts and feelings about art and how it should be democratic and how we should try to create an art which had a subject matter and a content and a meaning and a value and a moral dimension. And he listened very politely, I must say. And in the end he said, "Well, I hope very much that you won't succeed, but I rather think you might.
So,
And that was our teacher.
well, there's an early example of
Jealous teachers.
you coming up against jealous teachers or figures of authority, and you're in the, I suppose, traditional model of the avant-garde. You're kicking against the system in that sense. Now, here we are in the Brooklyn Museum, 2008. You've had pretty well every honour that the art world can bestow in terms of museums and where you show and so on. So do you now feel part of the system that you were kicking against? Are you part of the establishment, or do you still see yourselves as outsiders?
We feel totally outsiders. Absolutely. Nothing has changed from the first day to today. I really believe that. Nothing.
It is still a battle, but a very good battle, and one that we enjoy very much. We feel that our pictures and our exhibitions are still capable, as they were from the first day, capable of bringing out the bigot from inside the liberal and bringing out the liberal from inside the bigot. So it's always going to be an exciting time, and we like that.
We know when we walk the streets of London, a certain kind of liberal people, they frown at us when they see us.
Why do you think that is?
They don't accept our views.
They prefer an abstract work of art by a foreigner who's dead. then they feel comfortable. Especially if it's a name that you can hardly pronounce.
Thus spake Gilbert and George in Jackson Pollock's town. That's good, good. People, I think, will be very struck. I mean, many people will know you, or at least feel they know you, but people are always struck by the image that you create, the aura that you create, which go even something as superficial as the tailoring. Not that your tailoring is superficial, it's wonderful, but I mean, that's the first thing that people see. How did that decision come about? What made two art school students at the end of the 60s in London decide that wearing rather neatly tailored suits was the way they were going to dress, and that you've stuck at that ever since?
I think because we're both poor country people from a sort of lower class background who believe in being correct and being tidy, and people change into a good suit for a wedding or a funeral or a christening, or to apply for a job. For important occasions you look proper, and I think we just did that on a full-time basis.
And even when we went around with this box of ideas to all these galleries, we put on our Sunday best.
We always said we didn't want to be the artist with an eccentric appearance, with strange whiskers or sandals. We didn't want to be a hippie artist. In fact, we said that we dressed like this because we didn't want to become the artist that the mothers would be ashamed of. It didn't quite work out like that.
But you mentioned the fact that there's maybe a sharedness in background, that you said you're both country boys who came to the big city, and that's where you met. I mean, Gilbert, you were born in the Dolomites, so you were educated.
Came down from the mountains.
Came down from the mountains. George came from the southwest of England.
Came up from the valleys.
Up from the valleys, sorry. But people of all over the world, however much they seek to get on, we have differences. We have differences of opinion. Hopefully we can resolve them in civilized ways, or by debating or discussing. But you claim, but no one's ever really seen you argue, but do you never have creative differences? From the moment you started to become artists together, do you always think as one? People find that very hard to understand or even believe.
We wouldn't do anything that's not productive, that holds things back. Every picture that we don't make, somebody else is not going to make. We're all being dragged at increasing speed towards the grave, and we want to do pictures. Arguing would not help it at all. It would be wrong.
Yeah, I think we learned that compromise that works totally creative and totally what you call forward. Everything is forward. Everything has to work to the end result. That's important. The end result is the most important. Nothing else is important.
It's very good we clear this up, because normally it comes at question time and somebody says, do you ever argue? And we say, here comes the great heterosexual question.
You work pretty well. You work always in series, and people who know your work will be able to recognise the different series that these works come from. But I suppose for someone coming to your work for the first time, coming to see it at Brooklyn, you've mixed up work from different series throughout the exhibition. But of course, when you make the work, you would make 10, 15, 20 pictures with a specific location in mind, and the work has a sort of singularity, a totality. How is it for you now, seeing fragments of different series juxtaposed in different rooms here in Brooklyn?
It's very, very good for us. You know why?
Why?
Because we realized that if we would have done it chronological, they would have said, oh, we only like the early pieces. And now that's finished.
Which
true.
which is what you did at the Tate. The Tate was chronological.
Even if you have the exhibition chronological, it's too relaxing and too easy for the viewer. They can just stroll through it like a catalogue and just flick through it and see it all. If it's mixed up, we thought it was called anachronic, which is the opposite of chronological, but the underbite, the curator, says that it's diachronic.
Diachronic, yeah.
Diachronic. And I think in that way the viewer has to think more, he has to feel more.
Even it's very good, like you can create like a red room, like downstairs, where the bomb picture is roughly red. And then we can do a room that it is, 75 or 85, mix up the full color pieces and the very black and white pieces together to see how they look like. It is more thought-provoking.
What's interesting is because again, it's...
And they don't look, you don't see, oh, that's an old one, that's a new one.
No,
you don't see that
they do seem to mesh, absolutely. But I mean, you plan every exhibition. You have models. You plan it with rigorous, choice. Everything is known pretty well before you get to the space, physically to hang the show where things will be. Do you approach making exhibitions in a similar way to actually making work? That you take various subjects. You're playing with images, and therefore, in a sense, this is an installation.
Yeah.
It's a singular installation.
We always think of the viewer.
How they come into the room, how they will turn to the left, the next room. And that's completely the opposite of a museum curator. Museum curators and directors hang exhibitions to suit their taste. And we want to do it for the viewer, to guide the viewer through.
We want to create emotional rooms that speak to them. That's very important for us. They have to be able to remember those pictures. That's how we work. If they don't remember our pictures, we fail.
Do you surprise yourselves then? I mean, looking at this exhibition for 2 years, you've been made in a way to look back at what you've achieved over the last 30 years. Has it changed the way you've seen your work in any way?
That's already finished for us. We're already on a big news, group of pictures. Enormous. That's it. For us, it's future, forward.
We think, in fact, that we got traumatized by doing this huge tour. We stopped making pictures for a year because we had to attend to the different venues and all the celebrations and things. And early this year, something got hold of us. It is as though we were possessed. And we started to design a group of pictures, and we couldn't stop. We wanted to stop when we'd reached 20. We wanted to stop when we reached 50 designs. And it went on until somebody said that it was all right to stop at 153. We never did that in our whole life before. We never thought of it. We wouldn't consciously say, let's design over 100 pictures.
Like my niece said to me, 1 egg a day. 1 egg.
Well, that brings round, I think, to one of the key questions, really, which is the process of how work comes about, how it's made. How do you actually begin? Once there's a germ of an idea, could you just explain how you use images, how you have an image bank, how the pictures, how the series evolve, how you physically put them together?
First, we need the images. And the images are based on what interests us. No? And we collect images, all different kind of images, inside, outside, personally, different people, skies, symbols. So we have all this group of pictures, of images that go into a big bank of images.
So you've got thousands, tens of thousands of images.
Hundreds of thousands.
They are scanned in low resolution that you are able to call them up very fast. No? But our designs are all done by contact sheets on tables. So we have to be able to see what we have in front of us. Like in a computer, you could not call up 100,000 sheets. No? But you have them on table, you can have them. And then we design we have a rough idea, every day is different. A rough idea of what we want to do, and that's it, George.
The main thing is when we go to the studio in the morning is not to have any plans. We go completely as though we're deaf and blind and dead-headed. We don't want to know. And then however we are that day, that month, that year, that is how the pictures will be. We have to lift them out from inside of ourselves, drag them out. A lot of artists are able to pluck pictures or sculptures out of the air. Ours are all coming from inside, from our thoughts and feelings and memories, our hopes, our dreads, our fears, our loves, all out into the emotional format of the picture.
And sometimes, like, we take a lot of images, and in the end, when we are in front of when we start to do the designs, maybe we use only 10 or 15 sheets, because we are only into those ones.
We're always looking for the moral dimension in the subject matter. We wouldn't use something because it's pretty or nice, or because it looks good, or has a nice shape or a nice color. It has to have a human moral issue within it. For instance, years and years ago, we took images of chewing gums on the street, which had been pressed and trodden on. And you take them just after it's rained and before it's completely dry, so that the dirt is in all the cracks in the little chewing gums, and they're like a relief in a way, like a coin is a relief, like a bas relief. And of course, we didn't use them because you can't use a stupid thing like chewing gums in a picture. So a couple of years later, we took some more images, and another year. And then suddenly the moral dimension came to us, that some of those chewing gums are there, put there by a person who is now dead. Some of them was 2 days ago, some of them are in love, some of them are happy, some of them went to war, some of them are 30, 40, 50 years old. And they're each put there by a single human being. And they're very neglected. Nobody has a good word to say for them. Nobody wrote a poem about chewing gums. They're hated and despised, so we thought we'd give them a chance, give them some love, and put them in a picture. And we love them for that reason.
I suppose that's second only to pubic crabs, unloved subjects that you've collected and shown in your work.
Yes, we didn't love them very much at the beginning.
Yes, I made the mistake of asking you where you got those pubic crabs from once.
It's the journalist who said, "Where did you get them from?" I said, "The same place you get yours."
Just finally, just to finish my questioning on process, that you've always stuck to the grid, and art historians make the point that you emerged at the end of the 60s when minimalism was one of the dominant modes of artistic expression, and therefore they've likened your grid to that. Others have said that your work has resonance or associations with stained glass windows. How do you plead on either of those, or where do you see the structural influence coming from?
Wrong.
You think they're
wrong? Because we started out when we used to have such a little studio in Fournier Street, that we were only able to make a big picture out of small fragments. So we used to buy a packet of photo paper. And at that time, nobody was able to make a big artwork out of photographs. They never did before. So we had to learn how to make it more than just a photograph. So we started to put them together in some kind of kaleidoscopic structure, and then we pushed it together into format. But it's all based on protecting the work and being able to assemble and put it in a box to transport in other places, and nothing else.
It's just very simple. There are no aeroplanes big enough to transport these as a single image. It's also very good because of the lines, the grid, controls the composition slightly. We're not completely free like the artist in front of the blank sheet of paper or the blank canvas. That slight sort of discipline gives us a very good way of making a more controlled design. And it's very good for the emotion and the feelings, we believe.
But it was based on having a very small studio and trying to make something bigger than the studio.
And not having any money as well. Yeah?
You mentioned the studio, which has now got bigger, but this is Fournier Street. This is a wonderful part of East London. But I mean, you've been there for 40 years now. Does it still feel like the centre of the artistic world that you've created? I mean, when you're in New York, for example, now, are you still collecting images, looking for artistic inspiration, or do you feel in a different place, if you like, when you're, I mean, literally you are in a different place, but does it inspire you in the same way that the East End of London does?
I think wherever there are people and streets and dirt and dead things, I think we're always thinking and feeling. Yeah. But we wouldn't go out of our way to make a topographical art. We wouldn't fly out to the desert to sketch palm trees or camels.
But in fact, we never took an image outside the East End of London, roughly.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, we never did that. Because mostly, more and more now, we don't even do it in the streets of London. We are doing it just in the studio, just artificially.
Just explain, I mean, for people who don't know, though, what's happened? I mean, well, what has happened to that area and over the last 40 years, and how that's in a way impacted on your work?
It did become an enormous international, bubbling, extraordinary place with people from all over the world, and young people and designers. And I think there are 200 galleries just in that one little tiny district where there was not one when we were students.
And when George first took me to East End of London, it really felt like walking into a Dickens book. Like all this yellow light and this narrow street, this 18th century house and falling down, and all these dogs, and it was extraordinary. And just Jewish people, and at the beginning of the Bangladeshis.
We
and
love
some
change.
artists.
Very,
but
very
we were some of the first ones.
You say you love change, though, George. I mean,
Change and rolling change every day.
you don't mind the fact the art world's moved in there?
Not at all. They'll go sooner or later. It was very good. We said we've seen all the changes because when we moved there first, it was Yiddish speaking, some Polish speaking, Russian speaking. Then it became Maltese. Then it became Somali. Then the Bangladeshi, and city boys. We've seen the synagogue turn into a mosque. We've seen the Jewish off-license turn into a Hindi music centre. We even see the gents' public lavatories on Whitechapel turn into an Indian restaurant. So the young friends were recommending it to us. They said, it's very good food, the service is fantastic. And it's eat in or take away. I said, it always was.
In the early work, the General Jungle, for example, through there's a rural, sort of almost idealised rural backdrop. But you've talked about the East End of London. You said you were country boys who came to the city, and in London in particular, that's your place. Do you ever could you ever now consider the idea of making art that dealt with rural themes? Could you ever consider moving out of London and living in the country?
Not in a million years. We never go out in the country. Not once. I mean, we are dragged to we have to see a friend of ours once a year to little snoring, but by force.
Oh, and what is it about the country that you don't like?
I think because we were country boys, the first few years of our art, we didn't know how to express our thoughts and feelings with the city. So we used trees and grass and bushes and London parks. And then we became city people. And we could read newspapers and watch television and take part in the urban landscape. And I think we forgot completely the country. And I think it was 2 years ago we were invited to see a friend in the west of England in a small village. And we went down to see him. We got up early in the morning. And it was so incredibly beautiful. It was on an estuary and the sun was rising. And there were estuary birds swooping down. There was no motor traffic. You could hear insects buzzing by. And we walked up the little high street, and there was the parish church, medieval parish church, with all these lovely antique tombstones and the flowers. And Gilbert said, it's paradise, it's extraordinary.
One tomb was Gilbert and one tomb was George.
That's true.
That's true.
Yes, we looked through. One tomb was Mr. George, one was Gilbert. And then outside the church was a very pretty young couple, probably 18 or 20 years old. And they had a little baby in a pram, and that just sort of completed this whole idyllic scene. And it felt sad and romantic and lovely, and we said to the young couple, good morning. And the young man turned to us and said, fuck off, you weird-looking cunts.
That's it.
We said, now we remember what we didn't like about the country. So we ran back to London.
You mention the way that the East End of London's changed, and you do it often. I mean, you mention in terms of different religious groups. I mean, they're cultural groups, but first the Jewish population was there. Now it's Bangladeshi, and you said that the synagogue's been changed to the mosque. 2 years ago in London, you made an exhibition called the Son of a God pictures, which asked a question: was Jesus heterosexual? Not surprisingly, this. I don't think even you were surprised. This caused a certain indignation amongst certain people, although not actually amongst the majority of the gallery going public. There were about 50,000 people saw it, and there were very few complaints. But clearly, if you deal with religious subject matter in that way, even just asking a question, there's a provocation there. Were you genuinely, and are you genuinely interested in provoking when it comes to matters of religion, sex, race?
No, we just wanted to ask a question. What is religion? What is left of religion? Is it just superstition? Or what is it? Because we are not believers. No? And sometimes the churches did very bad things.
They were responsible for so many deaths. I think that's very provocative. I think the Inquisition was provocative. I think what the Pope says today is provocative. We think the Christian leaders should be taken to The Hague and tried alongside Milosevic. There are people committing suicide and murder at this moment in the name of Christianity, in the name of Catholicism. It's horrific what they do and get away with. And they show no sense of shame whatsoever. They put on their funny clothes and walk down the street towards the church with their head held high. It's a disgrace.
But it's extraordinary stuff, like towards, yes.
When you hear
homosexuality all over, like the Muslim, the Christian, all the big battle, because now we feel it is much more than ever before. If you open a newspaper in London, it's mainly so much to do with the religion, all the vicars, all the Muslims, all pretending what you call, going backwards. I thought we freed ourselves from that, from the 18th century on. Huh?
So you said you believe that change is you embrace change as a good thing, but this change in the world and in London in particular, where there's a kind of rise of fundamentalism, presumably you cannot embrace that. That's why you're challenging it.
We hate it. We challenge it. We would like to say, forget it.
It's quite strange when we did the exhibition, was Jesus heterosexual? All we had to say was yes.
You must have been something, no?
Or they could have said no. Quite strange because it had a very big review in the Church Times, it's the Anglican newspaper, which never reviews exhibitions normally, and in the Catholic Herald. Again, they hardly ever review exhibitions. And they both wrote in what I would say in a very un-Christian way, a very unfriendly, mean way. I didn't think that's Christian. But we did have enormous support as well from the Christian community, to be fair. One lady came up to us and said, speaking as a committed Christian, I must say congratulations, young men. You're asking all the right questions in our troubled times. It's quite amazing. And when the exhibition went to Castello di Rivoli in Torino, the director of the museum was very worried about having the picture, which is called Was Jesus Heterosexual, in the exhibition. And she was especially worried because her great-great-uncle had been made a saint. And I said, how did he become a saint? She said he gave all of the family money to the church. I said, that's called cash for honours in Britain. And she had to actually consult with her priest to get clearance that she was not going to sin. Even when it arrived in Munich, they had big trouble. They called in the priest who was looking after the souls of the German artists. Can you imagine? Do you think in New York there's somebody who looks after the artists' souls? I doubt it.
But it's amazing that he's still there in such a big way. Amazing power. We are not free from the church.
How dare they interfere? I wouldn't dream of going inside a church and complaining about what they're talking about.
So,
Freedom.
so you're, as you say, you're asking these questions, and it's often been said that people find your art shocking, but you've also said that what you want to do is de-shock. Just explain what do you mean by that?
I mean, they all seem to be shocked about sex, no? And we know that without sex we wouldn't be here. So what's so shocking?
No, I think because it's a museum or a gallery, people are a bit more weird. If it's the problem page of a woman's magazine, they're all very relaxed, no? They say, save your marriage, suck dick. Yes? If you say that in a museum, you're in trouble.
Yes, particularly with the camera running, that's good. Probably the pictures that still seem the most... I mean, I don't think people go into galleries and look at things and go, I am shocked. I think that's not a reaction they have. I think that's a media construct. But there's still many pictures of yours. I still look and look again and think I've grasped it, and then I need a double take. And they still surprise me. They still kind of shake me out of a complacency that one often has wandering around museums and institutions. Are the naked shit pictures where you use turds, but you've used all your own body fluids, semen, spit, tears. When you were conceiving that particular series, did you in any way discuss the idea that you may be transgressing a particular border? Were you interested in doing that?
No.
How did they come about then? Are they a form of self-portraiture because they're your body fluids?
We're just trying to accept ourselves totally in every way. That's why we wanted to do it without a suit.
Even I think that when we took images through the microscope of sweat and tears and piss, we found all these forms in there. In the sweat, for instance, we find swords and daggers. It's extraordinary. And they're like guns in the piss. There are actually contents, there are meanings there. And I think that's right, that the you inside of you is probably all over you, and the discovery of DNA rather proves that. They can take one piece of a fingernail from someone and find out that it's exactly that person. So maybe the you and you is not just in the head, or people used to think the you and you was inside the heart. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Or
the filmmaker.
I guess at the time we were designing those pictures, a young filmmaker was making a documentary about us. And so we saw him every day with the camera crew and filmed for some hours. And he saw the designs for those pictures and said, "Oh, what fun, you must be having such fun playing around with these things." And we said, "No, it's not fun at all, it's very serious, and for us it's very emotional to do. Oh, come off it, it must be a big laugh, shit and piss." And he just wouldn't believe us. And then a few days later he came in with a completely changed appearance. He was pale and he looked completely different. And he said that he felt he should apologize. And we said, "Why?" He said, "I realized that you were right about the images you were taking, because last night I went, as I do every evening, to visit my sister who was in hospital, having an operation to remove all of her bone marrow. She's suffering with leukemia. And whilst he was sitting at the bed, the nurse took a sample of the spit, and they took a blood sample, and they asked him if he would leave the room for a moment whilst they changed her toilet and things. Yeah? And in that moment he realized that for that sister of his, all of those things were a matter of life and death. Yeah? That it is what we are. If those things don't work, we're finished. We'll run to the hospital or to the mortuary. There's nothing funny about shit. If you have to give a sample stool to the doctor, he wouldn't giggle. It's an absurd idea. Yeah? But in a museum, they'll giggle in front of shit. It's quite different.
Something's just, it's got a very delayed reaction, but I've just remembered, you were just saying a few minutes ago that a woman who was a member of the Christian community described you as a young man, which is brilliant, because you do seem incredibly youthful still, although to call, I mean, she must have been getting on a bit to call you young men, with respect. Yeah, but there is that amazing youthfulness still, I think, about the work that you produce. You know, there's a kind of freshness to what you still do. A few years ago, Sensation was here in Brooklyn, which was the British, the generation of British artists who came to prominence in the 90s. It's often said that your godfather figures, father figures, although godfather would be a little provocative, I suppose, given what you've just said. But do you take responsibility in any way? Do you see yourselves as having an impact? Are you interested in the impact you may have had on British art, which was parochial in certain ways in the 1960s?
No, I don't feel we have any interest in what you think about us, except the viewer. And except when we walk the streets of London, somebody come up to us and say, "I saw your show and we like it." That's what we prefer than an artist trying to tell us something. We don't want to know anything by an artist.
But we're very supportive that there is and will be constant groups of artists coming out. It's very good. Every country needs more artists. There are not enough.
No, I think because we cut ourselves off from the art world in London, totally. And we only come out when we do an exhibition. If not, they will never see us. We are the, what do you call it, East End monks in some way.
The mad monks of Fonny Street.
Yeah, you're the mad...
And it works, because we only want to see the world in front of us and nothing else. We don't want to see art in front of us.
Some artists like to see art. We like to see things that are not art. We want undigested material.
So you don't go to museums
Not
ever?
One.
Unless you're exhibiting in them?
Yes.
We make an exception, yeah.
And it is much better because your brain is totally clear.
We're much freer in that moment. We have big empty areas in which to operate and think and feel. We're not cluttered with having to make decisions about things that we cannot affect. Even
if you start to go near the gallery, art politics start to be listened in, and we absolutely don't like it. That's very important for us, to be alone and free to do whatever we want. And that's even because we don't have assistants. We are doing it all ourselves, from the beginning to the end, except we have what we call
one
you
gentleman here.
again who help us. If not, we are doing from the beginning to the end alone.
You again, yeah.
He's scanning us.
He's scanning you, yeah.
I mean, those are the two great privileges that we feel. Number one privilege is being able to go to the studio in the morning and say in our pictures whatever we want without asking anybody anything. So that's an amazing privilege. We don't have a form and a boss, or we don't have to write down to check with anyone. And the second privilege is we are able to get these pictures together and bring them to a city, this time Milwaukee,
No,
and
Brooklyn.
and show them to tens of thousands of people. There's no other way we could do it. You cannot go through Milwaukee shouting blood, tears, spunk, piss. You get arrested, right? In a museum, you can get away with it.
So, how has the art world changed significantly in the last 40 years? What is the big difference between the art world that you entered as singing or as living sculptures in 1969, 1970 and where you find yourself now?
I mean, at the beginning there were so few galleries. Like in London, there may be 3 or 4 galleries. Now you have hundreds and hundreds of galleries, and you have thousands and thousands of artists. And the art world is so big now. It seems everybody wants to be involved in art, and that it didn't used to be. It used to be a very, very small family, you know, and it was a kind of international small family. And everybody had to be very nice to each other because we were so few.
So now it's big but backbiting.
I don't know what backbiting was huge compared. And also, I think it's rather good because people know artists and they know the work of artists and they know the names of artists. In the early 70s, nobody knew. If you asked a person on the street to name an artist, they would only come with Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo. They didn't know living artists. So it's much better now.
Let's throw it to the floor briefly, because I think there is probably 5 minutes to ask questions. Are there questions that people would like to ask on the floor? Yeah.
Well, going on something you said earlier, I'm curious if you didn't have each other, if you would be more engaged with other artists, you know, instead of being as isolated. Do you think having each other opens the possibility for you to remove yourselves from the rest of the art world?
I think being two removes self-doubt, and that gives us an enormous strength. Enormous strength.
Yeah,
I
right
can-
about
I
that.
can-
We
I
don't
can
need
demonstrate.
anybody.
Right.
It's absolutely.
Because it's always said that being an artist can be a very lonely occupation, but if there's 2 of you, by definition it can't be lonely, or less lonely than if there's 1 of you. Good question. Yeah.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Do you think there would be a clearer understanding of your work if art historians had never written about it?
Say it again, right.
Do you think there would be a clearer understanding of your work, art in general, if art historians did not write about it?
I'm sure. A lot of people who never read any catalogs or newspaper articles about us, when they see our work, have an understanding. We knew that from people who stop us on the streets and people who write us letters. I think it's very good if people want to see it in the sense of reading the introduction to the catalogue and studying earlier pictures and other artists of our generation. But it's not essential, we know that.
But interviews are very good. And now some book with a very big interviews, and there are maybe one way to the pictures here.
Just looking, I'm sure there are young artists and more senior artists in the audience too. And you've never gone back to art school to teach. I mean, you said at the beginning that you weren't those kind of artists, but I just wonder if you have any advice for artists who are not as successful as you, or for young artists who are still at art school, about how they might be successful. What would your advice be?
We used to have 2 bits. You had the second
Oh,
one.
yes, I have.
You have the second one. Right?
Yes.
We used to say, when you get up out of the bed in the morning, sit on the edge of the bed, keep your eyes closed and think, what do I want to say to the world today? And don't open them and do something until you've decided that. And then it won't matter what you do it with a computer or a brush or a pen. That's the way it goes. And the second piece of advice is,
Fuck the teacher.
On which note we should end. Gilbert and George, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.